very
This
important for
conference
your
will now be
information to
recorded.
understand what is supposed to be in the draft environmental impact statement. The next 3 pages are an excerpt from one of the important regulatory documents that explains what it is that the NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, how that is supposed to be implemented in projects like the I-81 Viaduct Project. The items in this page that are underlined are critical terms that we want everybody to be familiar with. And then the last page is just a list of some of the important documents that are all available online. And I'm sure you're all going to leave this today to go home and immediately pull all those documents and read them front to back, so you're fully informed. So the purpose, what we're trying to do today is we want to give everybody an update of where we are and what's going to be happening next. But we want to do that in a way that hopefully will entice you to join the team of people that are going to be engaged in doing an in-depth analysis of the draft environmental impact statement, and doing that in a way that maximizes the collective power of the residents of Syracuse and Onondaga County and larger region who are interested in having input into this particular process. The reason why that's important is because once the draft environmental impact statement is released, there will be a public comment period. Now, normally, that public comment period would last for 45 days. During that public comment period, everything that people submit to DOT, everything that people say in a hearing will be recorded, and the DOT is required to respond to that. And so that's important because while there have been lots of meetings that people have been participated in, they're not necessarily formal meetings where responses are recorded. And it's also the case that through that collective process, that's where we can have a public conversation so we all know what other people are saying. So part of what we're trying to do is set up a process for people who want to become formally engaged in that process. We'll have a way to interact with each other. The city is setting up an advisory group to help the mayor and the administration to work through the draft environmental impact process. We're setting up other mechanisms where people can communicate with each other so that everybody who's going to be commenting on the draft environmental impact statement has a mechanism by which they can become collectively engaged in amplifying the power of each person's voice, and hopefully giving it a technical foundation, which will provide more weight for the draft environmental impact statement and the public responses to that. I do have, for those people that are interested, and I'll pass around one copy of this, that is the public comments for the draft scoping report and the way that DOT responded to them. So if anybody hasn't seen this, you can just have a look at it and see what it's going to be like. Presumably, the draft environmental impact process and when they respond to the comments in the final environmental impact statement will be similar to this, although they may make changes from time to time. I'm supposed to stay here because of the webinar, but I have a tendency to walk around, so you can shout me back, Diane, if I go too far. Right. So going back to the process for the draft environmental impact statement, when it gets released, there should be a 15-day period between when the draft environmental impact statement is formally released and when the formal hearing is held. And then the 45-day public comment period begins. But that 45-day public comment period is only in at least 45 days. We have strong reason to believe that it will be considerably longer. Some have reason to believe that it may be as long as 4 or 6 months. In any case, one of the important first steps when the draft environmental impact statement is released is if it's not longer than 45 days, many of us are going to immediately contact DOT and say this needs to be longer, because the draft environmental impact statement is going to be a huge document. It's going to take a lot of work to analyze, and the public needs much more than 45 days. The time between when the draft scoping report was released and when the public comment period closed was 75 days. So we have reason to believe it will be at least 75 days. So that's the critical period in which we want to mobilize everybody to become involved in this process through the variety of mechanisms that we're trying to set up. So I just want to quickly turn to some of the key terms that you see on the front of the page before I turn it over to Yusuf and Lanessa to proceed. The second bullet point, informed decision making and consensus, or versus consensus. Now, I think everybody here is well aware that for 3-4 years now, the Save 81 folks have been presenting their tunnel vision as a hybrid consensus alternative that meets the needs of both those people who want a high-speed thoroughfare through Syracuse as an interstate and those people who want a community grid. The problem with that notion is that, one, they're selling that as a consensus alternative. And so that's one of the problems, of course, with that notion that this idea is a consensus alternative. And they're saying that, and some politicians have jumped on the bandwagon and say, we have to reach a consensus. If we don't, we're not going to get a project. So I just want to note that in terms of the regulatory process, DOT is not required to reach a consensus. All DOT is required to do is to engage in an informed decision-making process. If you look at all the documents, and actually the term consensus appears quite a lot in the DOT project development manual, the term consensus is only applied to specific meetings and specific junctures in the process where there needs to be some agreement about what you need to do next. The term consensus is never applied to the whole decision-making apparatus for the build alternative. And you have at the top a quote from Commissioner Joan McDonald, who in response to Senator DeFrancisco, who has been saying along with his cohorts that we have to reach a consensus, Commissioner McDonald said, while consensus may be desirable, it's not the defining authority. The defining authority is the technical analysis, the environmental impact statement. And that's why we're here doing what it is we're doing today. Yes, it will be available electronically. It'll be either available online or you can get it from me. You mean the DEIS or this presentation? Can you tell? Okay, the DEIS will be available online. If you want this presentation, it will be available online. I'm not sure exactly where yet, but you can always email me, belsyr@aol.com, and I'll send it to you. So the second bullet point, technical feasibility versus viability. This is really important to understand this because we do not at present have any kind of a viable tunnel alternative. We do not have any kind of a viable hybrid, as it has been so-called, presented by the Save 81 folks. The independent tunnel study concluded that a tunnel is technically feasible, but they did not study the viability of a tunnel based on any criteria other than their own understanding of what's required to build a tunnel. So essentially, they told us what we already knew. We can build a tunnel. We knew that from the beginning. The question is not whether we can build a tunnel, it's whether a tunnel is viable given the environmental impact statement requirements that you have to go through in order to determine what the impacts are of whatever your build alternative is. So right now, we only have two alternatives that have been deemed viable at this stage of the process. That is a community grid and a new viaduct that would be higher and wider. Those are the only two viable alternatives that DOT has presented so far. The second bullet point, proportional significance of impacts. This is a very important aspect of the environmental impact statement process. And the easiest way to explain this is that, yes, those who have pointed out that this is a regional project that impacts the whole region from Oswego to Binghamton, from Utica to Auburn. I think I directionally did it the wrong way. But in any case, that everybody in that region has needs and interests that need to be addressed. That said, the proportional significance of those interests is a critical part of those analysis. So the question is, are the needs of interest of people who live in Oswego or Auburn or Binghamton or Utica the same as the needs and interests, or as significant proportionally as the needs and interests of the people who live in Syracuse close to the pathway of the I-81 Viaduct? And we'll be getting into that a lot more with the other presentations. The next point, cumulative effects. With respect to that, it's important to understand that cumulative effects applies to in terms, again, the regulatory documents, past, present, and future. Although DOT will generally try to tell you that as is the case with smart growth, cumulative effects only goes forward. That's not true. The requirements say cumulative effects is supposed to be past, present, and future. So, for example, when folks like John Katko say, as he said in every one of the recent forums that he had, that it was a mistake to build I-81 through Syracuse. Governor Cuomo has admitted that was a mistake. Many of the people who are supporting continuing I-81 through Syracuse say it was a mistake to do it originally. Okay, if it was a mistake to do it originally, then what is the cumulative effect of continuing to carry that into the future? So that's a critical area of analysis that can be applied to all of the different categories of the EIS. And then the last bullet point that I'll say something about and then get off and turn it over to Yusuf is interdisciplinary and interagency methodology. DOT is required to employ an interagency and interdisciplinary methodology. Now, where that becomes critical is DOT has been fond of saying at times in the past that, well, analyzing that is beyond our scope. Well, nothing should be beyond their scope. If they don't have the capacity to do that, then they go out and hire somebody to do it, or they go to another state or federal agency to engage them in an interdisciplinary and an interagency analysis. So the reason why all of these things are important, and the reason why we need to engage as many people as possible in a collective process, is that once the DEIS drops and we have a chance to get into it, we need to analyze it and be prepared to stop the process and say, this analysis is not adequate. We need further work, because it's to our advantage to make sure that happens. And if that means a delay of another 6 months or another year, that's better than the alternatives. So I'm going to stop at this point because we'll come back and revisit these things as we go through the presentation. Just one difference is we were going to break for a question and answer after Yusuf made his presentation, but he's now able to stay the full time. So we're going to hold for general question and answer until we get to the end and do it. And although I guess we'll respond to some questions as they go. Yeah. Okay. Yusuf.
The reason why I had to go is because Friday is the Muslim Sabbath, and my soul is seeking to not be damned. But apparently, I'm here instead because 81 matters so much. And so, thank you, Barry, for helping to condemn me for all of eternity. I appreciate it. Right?
While they're speaking, better pass these around to sign up. There's a category on here for EIS. If you're interested in engaging in the collective process, check that column. So the column on the far right.
As Barry said, my name is Yusuf Abdul-Qadir. I'm the director for the New York Civil Liberties Union Central New York chapter. How are you doing? And he said a lot of what I was going to say. And so not only are you damning my soul, you stole my whole routine here, Barry. But I want us to kind of get in a position where we're getting to elevate the kind of conversations that we're having around 81 and the replacement. I've been terribly disappointed, offended, and discouraged in many respects with the type of ways that we talk about the realities that people experience as they live along a viaduct as 81 is. We already know, and this is publicly accessible information, the Centers of Disease Control has released reports talking about residential proximity to highways and how your life expectancy decreases when you live next to a viaduct. We know from that report that people are more likely to have asthma, other respiratory illnesses, cardiovascular diseases, because of the types of pollutants that are emitted as you live along a viaduct. We know that there's decades upon decades of research that talks about the interstate highway system, and I want people to kind of separate our current realities from what was a major movement of resistance to desegregating the United States and the utilization of the interstate highway system as a means to further the interest to maintain segregation and to ensure the furtherance of a racial caste system. And as a result, 50 years after this viaduct, we have the highest concentration of poverty amongst Blacks and Latinos in the country. We have the 9th most segregated county in the country. We have the most segregated school voters within a county in the entire state of New York. We have a completely underfunded school system that, to remind us, New York State is not fulfilling its constitutional requirement to provide a sound, not stellar, not excellent, not dynamic, basic education. And as a result, we've reduced the conversation about the potential realities that can come out of what happens when we replace this viaduct to, I want to get from point A to point B in a more expeditious time. We've allowed the conversation to be a conversation about really mythologies, right? And so we're going to have a whole bunch of traffic that's going to automatically emerge out of the sky where cars are just going to drop as if that's real. There are real scientists and engineers who have actually done the numbers to look at and assess commute times and the implication of those commute times. And we know as a fact today, based on those numbers, that the inconvenience is going to be maximized at most to 5 minutes. We know that people are having a conversation about whether or not natural land will have to be removed if we expand 481. And we know that the requirements that the Department of Transportation has is to give you 4 acres for every acre of land that you will lose in that respect. We are having conversations about truck traffic coming from the north that will now be dispersed across suburban communities, which is not factual. And there are ways to mitigate that by applying new rules to reducing and in fact eliminating and fining from a municipal perspective trucks from doing that, to prohibit that from happening. We are not having a real conversation about if we do have a tunnel, and I'm going to diverge from Barry a bit and not say a tunnel and a hybrid, because there is no such thing as a hybrid. There are 2 tunnels. There's a $3+ billion and an almost $4 billion tunnel. That is the difference. They're 2 tunnels. We're not having an actual conversation about where is the water treatment facility going to go to treat the water that has to be pumped out? Where is the air filtration system going to go that has to ensure the clean air? Is it going to go either on the north or the south? Because the only 2 places it can go. And so is it going to go where the hotels are in the north, in the town of Salina, or is it going to go in the south end of the city of Syracuse? We're not having that conversation. We're not having a conversation about who's going to be stuck with the bill for the minimal $10 million a year for the 50-year duration of this viaduct, of the potential tunnel options. We're not having that conversation. And the ways in which I want to try to engage in this kind of conversation that we're having now is to ensure that when we do get the release of DEIS, that we do take an interdisciplinary approach to assessing all of those implications and beyond. We are not elevating the conversation in such a way to ensure that we can remedy the real harm that has been done, is currently being done, and will likely be done if we further these policies. And my colleague Lanessa is here because of the New York Civil Liberties Union, which is the ACLU of New York. We have not a partisan position, not a position other than ensuring the protection of the civil liberties and civil rights of the constituents who live in that era. We don't even have a position on the options, to our dismay in some respects. We're actually talking about the basis whereby the process has to be centered, and the process should be centered around technical analysis, and the process should be centered around elevating and ensuring that these issues are mitigated. And we're not having that conversation. So the kind of conversation that I want to have in the time that I am able to be here today, and I'll try to be as brief as possible, is around the need for us to engage in a conversation that addresses the socioeconomic impacts as well as the environmental justice impacts of the current reality that we have, and the potential for us to create a new vision, and the need for us to really be engaging in the kind of conversations that are going to elevate those points, and the need for us to be able to build a type of consensus, and I don't want to say consensus in the sense of like we all have to agree. I mean, build an understanding between those who are going to be advocates for the communities that are directly impacted as to how we can begin to advocate and better be in a position to advocate based off of the information that we have about what's not in the information that is released when it comes out, and how we can ensure that the process is going to be fair and equitable. As Barry said, we're having a conversation, and I represent in my region Oswego County, and I represent Oneida County, and I've got 8 counties in my jurisdiction, so I've got a 10,000 foot view. In fact, Lanessa will probably tell you, I spend a lot of my time just driving to Oswego to come right back down I-81 just to see how many options are there to get to downtown Syracuse, and there are lots. There are lots. But none of those people live directly next to that highway. None of those people are experiencing the hyper-segregation in housing in schools, the underfunded schools, the housing limitations, the concentrated poverty, the respiratory diseases. And we're asking that they continue to experience that so that people can have 5 minutes of convenience. Now, this is a racial justice issue. It is an economic justice issue. It is an environmental justice issue. But this is a significant racial justice issue because those who are disparately impacted are people of color. Those whose voices, even in the DOT's process about thinking through how they're going to redesign the project, which they have done multiple times, hasn't integrated and centered the voices of those who live along that viaduct. Just because you have a meeting in the city of Syracuse at the On Center doesn't mean we should presume that that now ensures that the voices of the people who live in Pioneer Homes, the private homeowners, and the private renters who live in that area have been engaged in any robust way. And I think it's important for us to understand, not just to compare this process to other processes that have happened across the country, because there's some differences and nuances between how departments of transportation engage and behave in other parts, and there are different regulations. But in New York State, the New York State Department of Transportation has already engaged in a process in the Bronx along the replacement of Sheridan Expressway that was way more robust and earlier on by creating a process that integrated what they call the community option. And in that process, it wasn't determined that it was more efficient to get people from point A to point B through their quote unquote community option. But when they considered all of the other factors, it was actually more beneficial for them to go in that route. And so we do know that commute times aren't the central reason why you determine whether a highway project should be done or not. I want to end because I know there are other people who have to speak. And you know, it's Friday and I didn't get to go to church or to mosque, so I can't preach to you today, but I'm going to preach you spirit right now. And so I'm going to calm it down a bit. But I want us to understand why we are involved in this process and why I think there's an additional lens that we should begin to think about this. Because in 2015, the Obama administration engaged in a process through the Federal Department of Transportation, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and Department of Education to understand how did we get to this point whereby we have these communities that are so segregated in the ways that we see them. And there was an understanding that the ways in which the Federal Highway Act created the highway system really created a means for de facto rather than de jure segregation. And they understood that because these highways are coming to the end of their useful lifespans, that it meant and it required for there to be this interagency collaboration and engagement in a way that would mitigate those impacts. And so they created a new rule to affirmatively further fair housing, whereby they stressed the need for the Department of Housing and Urban Development, Department of Transportation, and Department of Education to collaborate with and amongst each other, because DOT can deal with and address the transportation types of issues. There will be issues that may need to be mitigated that are outside of the Transportation Department's scope that can be mitigated through housing and urban development. To give you an example, the potential under any of the options for there to be displacement, despite the fact that Department of Transportation says today that there will be no need for people to be displaced, with the types of toxins and the environmental pollutants that have been underground for 50 years that will now be exposed for 4 years and beyond, for people who live directly with the highway as their back door, to think that they're not going to, from a very technical, I'm seeing one of my former professors who's a civil engineer, so please correct me if I'm mistaken. From an engineering perspective, you can definitely probably cut, drop, and haul. You can do it. But should people have to live along that as that's happening? Where is the actual space to put the trucks that have to come and haul? How are those trucks going to be idling, and what's going to be the type of pollutants and the air quality controls that are going to make sure that we're not further exposing people to pollutants? What are we going to do to mitigate the fact that, again, all these pollutants are like going to be exposed, and you can build a net, but it have to go to the moon to ensure, because diffusion goes from an area high concentration to area low concentration, it will be dispersed. How are we going to ensure that we're not further enabling people to get those types of illnesses and diseases? And I don't think that when we think about the implications and the breadth of this project that we're addressing that. And the last thing I want to say is, we're not taking the opportunity to think and dream big. We're not talking about the means that we can have an interconnected community that has a multiple options for transportation, that the Department of Transportation can actually fund, like mass transit, bus rapid transit, light rail, etc. We're not thinking about the inequities in transportation that exists where there are jobs. And so a lot of the reasons why people have concentrated or existing in concentrated poverty are because they can't get to where the jobs are. We've designed and developed a community where the vehicle is the means whereby you can have upward mobility or an option to be able to get a better education. If you don't have a car, then you are excluded from that reality, which means you don't get a chance to get a better job. It means you don't get a chance for your kids to have an opportunity to go to better schools. It means you don't get the same types of options to engage in the American dream, as we so call it, that others in the community have. And really, quite frankly, we've developed in Syracuse and in Abdul-Qadir County a racial caste system where the single greatest determinant, or one of the greatest determinants of people's viability, is their zip code. And that zip code has been centered around racial divisions. And I think we have to own that. We have to accept it. As a person as a 6-month-old, it's often I'm engaging the conversation with my wife and I about whether or not, and I appreciate the concerns that people have about their kids wanting to go to good schools. And for a lot of folks, it isn't because they don't want to see Black and brown folk. For some people it is, and I think we have to be honest about that. And traffic time and travel time becomes a proxy for that. I don't want to see it. I want to just get home. And I think we have to own that. But for a lot of folks, it's really just about, I want my kids to have a better life off than I did. And I appreciate that. I have a 6-month-old. So I get it. But does that mean that those who live in that area shouldn't also have the same opportunities? Does 5 minutes negate the chances for people to get out of poverty, to have a chance to make this community better, to not have the greatest defining moments of who we are being concentrated poverty and hyper-segregation? We should be embarrassed and ashamed that that is how we are known across the country, because we are known for being one of the most segregated counties in the country. We are known for being one of the most highly concentrated poverty communities in the country. And that's not a badge of honor, that's a badge of shame. And we should use this process as a means to get us out of here. I'm gonna allow my colleague Lanessa to add additional comments, but thank you.
I'm going to be real quick. I just want to build a little bit on what Yusuf was talking about to give you guys an idea of the census tract we're talking about and the neighborhood that we're referring to. So we're talking about census tract 42, and that census tract is the area that rides along I-81 Viaduct on the south end of Syracuse. 67% of that area are living below the federal poverty line. Just to give you an idea, when we're talking about communities of color, we're talking also about a very, very poor community. There's a school there. There's Dr. King Elementary School there, where there's 509 students, 95% of which are kids of color. Out of those 95% of children of color, 85% of them qualify for free lunch. Okay, so we're talking about an area that's already facing astronomical challenges. We're talking about a community that doesn't have access to transportation. They don't have access to jobs. Central has publicly said that there's a mismatch between public transportation and where the jobs are. And so we're talking about a community that's landlocked in their area. We're talking about a community that has dealt with redlining, urban renewal, have been displaced from the 15th Ward as a result of the highway. And we view the highway as a driver of all of those things. And so while the New York Civil Liberties Union is more concerned about the process and making sure the process is fair and equitable, and that the benefits and burdens are spread across the region equally, we can also say, if we look at the options, there is an option that gives us an avenue to regain people's civil rights, regain people's financial freedom. And if we look at the construction times, such as the community grid that takes 4 to 2 years to construct, The first 2 years will be on 481, and then the second 2 years will be on the actual census tract I just referred to, versus an option like the tunnel that could take 9 to 14 years to construct. And when we look at the impact of that neighborhood, having the highest rates of asthma, having the highest rates of respiratory disease, having the highest rates of COPD, we can analyze that under a civil liberties lens and say, yeah, 2 years of construction is a lot better of 9 years of construction. There's a stretch along the viaduct where homeowners live 5 feet away from the highway. So we think about 2 years of construction of their houses vibrating versus 9 years of construction of their houses vibrating and dealing with all the other environmental impacts that will happen just for the construction alone. And when we think about transportation, of already having a huge barrier for transportation, we think, how are those buses going to be able to navigate those city streets around the construction, and will they have access to them? How will children walk to school every day in a construction zone? And when we think about options that take 9 years, 14 years, we're talking about children spending their entire elementary career in construction. And what we know about kids, I got a 16-month-old, they climb and they love things that are dangerous, right? And so how are we going to keep those kids from jumping in construction zones versus going to the park? And so when we look at the options through a civil liberties, civil rights lens, we can obviously say removal of the viaduct is the best solution for protecting people's rights who live on the viaduct. We're talking about Syracuse Housing Authority have apartments that are 7 feet away from the highway. 7 feet away from the highway. And when we compare that to 481 being a half a mile to a mile away from the nearest neighborhood, for us it's a no-brainer. And so as we look at the process, and we can't take a hard stand and say we are for the community grid, because we don't do that. That's just not what we do as an agency, because what we do know is we also have to be mindful of making sure the community grid is a responsible community grid, an equitable community grid, and the people who live in that neighborhood are considered first for any subject or any conversations we're going to have about what's going to be developed on that 7 acres of land once the community grid happens. And so I just wanted to kind of bring that full circle and build upon what Yusuf said to paint a picture to those who maybe have never been in that neighborhood before and understand what we see every day. And so every Saturday we canvass that area. We talk to homeowners, we talk to residents. Every Tuesday we're hosting workshops in that neighborhood to get people up to speed about what's happening in their own neighborhood, because as of right now they don't know. There hasn't been adequate outreach. They're not speaking in a language they can understand, and they're using maps that we don't read anymore to describe what's going to happen in their neighborhood. You have homeowners that have been there for 30, 40 years who do not want to move. They have grandchildren. They are afraid of what's going to happen. They have real concerns. And as a civil liberties union, we cannot answer those questions because DOT does not have a working comprehensive plan on how they're going to mitigate or avoid impacts in that neighborhood. And so while we push along and say we want the community grid or we want this option, be mindful that the people in that neighborhood, their voice need to be played first, and you need to consider their voice in any conversation you're having about a community grid option, a tunnel option, or a viaduct. Thank you.
You guys yet who's going to go next? Okay.
Thanks. I'm Bob Haley, and I've been here a number of times on this subject. It's.
If you point to something on the PowerPoint, please.
Okay, how do I change this on? Okay, thank you. Thank you. We need all of this, right? Mike, can someone? Okay. This is good to be part of a group like this, and we're in a unique situation being here today because we are at the brink of seeing, after 7 years of study, the 3 options that will be part of the draft DEIS. We haven't seen them yet. Today, we haven't seen them. We've seen previous versions that are 2 to 3 years old. We've had a lot of assumptions. The good news about this timing is that so many more people are engaged, just like today's meeting. A lot more people are much more deeply engaged, knowledgeable. The articles that are going on in the paper are interesting to read because, in my view, there's a lot more people seriously looking at these issues and looking at it in terms of our total community. Now, we've had people come up here tonight are new champions. I call them new champions because some of us have been working on this for centuries. I don't mean that they're new champions, they're super champions. But a group like the Moving People Transportation Coalition has been supporting our transportation in our city, whether it was walking, biking, or buses, or highways throughout this entire DOT process. Somehow or other, I have to stay on track here. What I wanted to say today is a few bits and pieces that are kind of big picture issues that are critical to right now about the draft EIS. The DOT has a process. The draft EIS, environmental impact, is a critical component. Our job now really is to be a fair evaluation of every item on these criteria compared to the three options that the DOT is going to propose to us. This is not a transportation issue. It's a community planning issue. Why? Because this highway went through the middle of an urban center, a history that was 150 years old when it started to go through the city. We've had the canal, we've had pathways through here, we've had footpaths, we've had canals, we've had railroads, and we have highways and airports. The three previous versions, the canal and the railroads, used to come through the center of the city, and they are now moved out and around the center of the city. The dynamics of time change. We're in a massively different time period, changing highway conditions, and the future is changing faster than it ever has in terms of what's on the horizon for transit and for people, population, and density centers, and how people will live in the future, how people will, like us, will choose to use your time on your laptop, on your computer, in your communication with each other. We're not going to want to sit behind that car anymore and just hum and vibrate. And that's what's happening now in transportation. People know it, so it's a changing time. A few critical issues that I hope to mention today somehow or other and get through this quickly is the AIA group has been studying this for 7 years, working with the different agencies, the DOT for 5 years and the local groups in planning for the previous years before that. What's critical right now is there's some fundamental issues that are not in coordinated pattern for an urban planning project. One is the DOT has three options. They're looking at land taken away from and properties that will have to be taken for those options to happen, but they're not looking at the land coming back. It is not in the current information that we have that the DOT will give any land back from their current right-of-way through the center of the city. Even though we propose that there's value in that land, the AIA did a study, land planning strategies. I've got to go through this quickly here. Looking at how much land might be generated. I'm trying here. Good. The land planning strategy, we found 18 acres of land that potentially is right in the heart of the city that could be used. That's a small amount of land because there's more land north and south of the center of downtown that could be given back to the neighborhoods or the context or the residences or the business districts next to the edges of I-81. I-81 goes through 11 city neighborhoods, distinctly different 11 city different neighborhoods. We have kind of the north side, the middle, and the south side. It's kind of the three big areas, but there's subtleties in each of these. So the tax bases, we found that there's tax that can come from this. One single block in downtown, developed to today's standard of density, which is the university or the hospital areas as well as downtown, can generate approximately $3.5 million worth of tax revenues per year based on that value if it were developable in the center of the city. That's one block of the 18 acres. From that, there's a third strategy that we're proposing, long-term jobs. If you develop the land that we could get back from the I-81, the viaduct coming down, you can not only build on it, but it provides long-term jobs for people who work, live, and take care of those buildings over the next 50 years. So this is not only tax base every year, but it's jobs for people who live in our city and work in our city, as opposed to just concrete strips or a tunnel going through our city. That's one big issue. Here's a small example. This is an aerial view at Harrison's at the bottom here. I-81's north. This is the north looking. You're looking straight down on I-81 and 81 North is going straight up, and Harrison is going across the bottom. Here's the current pathway, but here's an example of how wide the highway needs to be. These are the arrow, dimensional arrows here. This is wider than Salinas Street, so that's 107 to 118 feet, which is needed simply for 2 lanes of direction, two ways of traffic, plus parking on either side, plus 15 feet of sidewalk and trees to the building property line. That leaves this much more land here to here, from here to here, that could be returned to adjacent property owners. That's the type of land that can be pieced off and parceled and given back to recreate a city where people live, walk, shop, and eat. Well, that's one example. The DOT has this is their drawings from a couple years ago, showing an analysis. This is blurred because I copied it badly, but it's the 3-dimensional tax base wealth in the city between the university areas and the hospitals. This is Destiny. This is the university areas. This is St. Joe's, and downtown, assessed value tax base. What's interesting here is the trough that goes through here that is a negative impact between this source and this source. Sorry, I'm supposed to wander. The point is that that the negative impact has decreased property value either side of the highway, right through the middle of our city. In fact, the highway, both 690 and 81, take up about 25% of the city's footprint. When you look at a 500-foot or a 200 to 500-foot swath either side of it through the city, that's a huge amount of our tax base and a huge amount of impact. We've talked about that potential. We've tried to visualize better than highway. We've tried to visualize better than just traffic routes and arrows and numbers of cars. So here's the case that if that land were coming back and this viaduct went down, that over time, oh, isn't this strange? That's not what I wanted to do. It was supposed to blend. I don't know where the little boxes, the pixels came. You like the boxes? Glad, super. I'm glad you're happy. I had no idea. The issue here is that this is what a city street looks like. And this has the tax base and people working and living in these for years to come. It means people don't have to drive back and forth to work. And this is mid-size, and this is the scale of Syracuse development that we now have going on, and we've had going on for years. Okay, I'm going to jump. There's the 18 acres of land in the green in the upper left. What's interesting about the diagram on the right is that there's 81. I hope you can see this. There's 81 going through the full north-south. And the blue areas either side of 81 are the potential more land than the 18 acres that we've even articulated. The green area right in the center of the right-hand side is the rough area of the 18 acres that we're looking at. So there's much more potential. So the community grid option can give the DOT more latitude to include more land back into the city's future growth. The north side neighbors in the north, in the hospital area, as well as the Mission Landing, have looked at this with DOT and looked at land that could be developed back to businesses, residences, and so on. If I haven't done enough rambling already, there's New Horizons. Look what's come out in the last month. Blueprint 15. I say the ghost of the 15th Ward. I don't know what it is yet because I don't know it well enough. I'm reading on it now. I'm trying to find out who the participants are and the players are as architects and planners so we can assist in that. Second part, Syracuse Surge. A big, huge effort of redirecting some monies from the state into the south side. These are huge, impactful, brand new efforts that are going to come into the I-81 dialogue. We have to keep that in mind as we go forward with the DOT process. I bring back this too, for those who've been in the room, the Gateway Project 2006. This is an adopted plan by the Common Council that was based on residents' input from 1999 to 2006, looking at the southeast neighborhood. We worked with Syracuse University, Syracuse students, neighbors. We had community charrettes, we had dialogues. We built a plan. This is just some of the other participants in this area. Syracuse students, this is the economic area that was done for economic analysis by a consultant that came in with the MDA, which is now COE. It developed a set plan that has been adopted. It's the only adopted Common Council plan in the city of Syracuse in I think many years. I don't want to say how many, I think 50 plus years. But it showed you growth pattern on smart design, urban design planning to use as guidelines for future development. Hold the bottom. What do I hit? Don't hold the bottom of it. This guy's a performer.
It looks like it.
Boy, I'm done. Is this working? Can you hear me? I'll just holler. The key thing here I wanted to point out in this diagram is that this is pre-planning. This is called intellectual capital from the planning community and monies invested in past projects. The two diagrams here show for the Gateway community from Salina Street down near the old Coin Laundry Company and Portland Avenue, but it shows a plan of how to develop that area with the concepts that current mall development and leasing development and mixed use housing are using. So that's mixed use, commercial at the first floor primarily, and residential as an office on the upper floors. What's interesting here too is this was based on taking all the resources in place in 2006, it's not that long ago, and looking at those as resources to do a new development project. It even had brownfield sites in there for dollars to remove brownfield federal and state monies, and that was all included in this plan. One aspect is here on the right, this is the Sears building right here. Okay, in that plan of 2006, the residents talked about what they wanted in that building. And this plan had it included, written down, and documented as to what it would be. It would be community services, but not just one service, a variety of services. And it would be decided by the residents what kind of variety of services would go in there. It's a bit of a failing when we had an opportunity to move forward, but it closed up so quickly. I won't say any more on that because that's a tough issue. What I am saying is there were planning and intellectual capital and community thoughts into this plan that could have been used to help resolve that issue. The new surge, Syracuse new surge, here is just a diagram that we've seen in the paper recently showing, I think, 200 million, sorry, a part of the upstate urban initiative that had been local, now looking at is focusing on this area, which is a tremendous jump forward. Of course, and I don't want to be too critical here because we're all players in this community, but we need to play together more than we do. My biggest issue over my entire career has been the number of individuals who are strong-minded, good planners, working independently and unfortunately not collecting all of these talents to go forward with a large community plan. We do not have a strong vision for the plan of this community. This is a brand new opportunity. We need to make the most of it, fold in the best of these three subjects. I-81, our community needs from the past that we've talked about, Syracuse Surge, education, education, education over and over again, because it's the base of our total future and our families. Here's an example. Here's the new Surge plan. I haven't seen anything in this yet, and I haven't yet had the meetings and asked these of the professionals who are running this program. But here's an example of the previous Gateway Community Plan with all this information, including economic analysis, including lists of stores and shops that people wanted. And this shows the diagram of how that fits into it. It should be included. Matrix, again, we're at a point now where we're going to get overwhelmed with technical information. The caution would be, let's not deal with the details. Let's take the large, big picture, best answer for our community. So you have to look at constructability, and you have to look at travel times, which are 5 minutes. Syracuse isn't the best freaking condition for travel times of any community in the nation. Okay, we don't have a problem there. But the matrix, the fair evaluation by all of us at this time is critical for what the DOT is about to show us. That's it.
No PowerPoint?
No PowerPoint.
Well, all right then.
He's a freestyler.
Yes, I'm a freestyler.
You're a freestyler.
I thought you guys had the Wikipedia
We're
page.
gonna put you up on the screen then.
Okay, there we go. Am I using this mic?
This is apparently the only one that's working. Well,
All right, check, check. Yeah, it's all right. All right, well, I see a lot of familiar faces in the room. A lot of grid supporters, a lot of people who are not or have not made their minds up, but I feel like most people here know a lot of the broad strokes. So I'll try to be brief and get to questions because I think there'll probably be a lot more gain from our collective time together through questions and answers and discussion than just a speech. But I guess I'd like to focus on political will and what we're doing with the Common Council. We've tried to have a lot of conversations, public conversations, and I think we're all just really eager to see the DEIS come out. I think this conversation should have been from the beginning about the information and the data and what we were learning. Instead, it's become a lot of fear and misinformation. And that's kind of my big thing is I'm all for a fair fight. I'm all for a robust debate. I grew up in a family where debate was a frequent dinner time activity that we all enjoyed. But I can't stand it when there's intentional misinformation out there. And I think we have a lot of that around the 81 issue. But another thing I'd like to note in living this issue for the last year or so, there's a great article from 2014, I think, by a man named David Rubin, who did How Did We Get Here? And I've done a lot of online debating. As I said, I like to debate. So I've whenever Syracuse.com has posted articles on 81, I frequently hop into the comment section, not to fight, but to clarify some questions or statements that are made by people. So one of them is that how 81 was brought here by the city planners of the city of Syracuse, the mayor and the council, and everybody worked together to increase our economic growth here in the region. If you read that Rubin article, you will see that that is very far from the truth, and that this was something that was imposed. The city was originally supposed to pay 50% for the project. The federal government stepped in and offered to pay 90% of the project, but with that was tied the elevated highways portion, because that's what the federal highway plan was at that moment. So this was something the mayor at the time robustly opposed, something that the Common Council at the time of this construction robustly opposed. The citizenry opposed it, and it was something that, you know, in the article it says we should have just had a riot in Syracuse, but we didn't. We allowed it to be built. And to Barry's point earlier about this being a mistake, and tying it back to that element of misinformation, when we talk about the hybrid, I don't know how in the weeds everybody in the room is, but I see our fabulous Assemblyman Al Sturpey in the back, who said something great at the last town hall, which was, we keep talking about this hybrid where we're having the conversation right now, and all of our suburban leaders have come together to voice their support for this hybrid option. I wrote an op-ed that was not printed, I don't know why, but a letter to the editor that I sent in that there's a suburban support for an option that does not exist. So when we're talking about information with the DEIS when it arrives, as Assemblyman Sturpey said, if we had a shallow tunnel, we would not be able to build on top of that. If we had a deep tunnel, we would need ramps to go down and come into it and come out of it. You cannot build a grid on top of that. So I don't mind if you want to make the three options clear and say we want a tunnel, or we want a viaduct, which would be a wider and taller viaduct. But I don't take kindly to the misinformation. So yeah, I would just encourage everyone. There's a thing in marketing and in that I often use in politics that's important to remember, called the curse of knowledge. It's a marketing term that when you know something, you assume everybody else knows it. And as someone who goes into rooms of people who don't know what is going on with 81, not many people know. As Lanessa was talking about, a lot of people don't even know this decision is being made or is happening in a lot of rooms in this city. So I would encourage you all to keep up the conversation in regards to the facts of the issue, because the options that we have before us are the community grid, a taller and wider viaduct that would require the destruction of 25 buildings and expand the footprint of the viaduct through our community, or we have a tunnel option, which is $3.4 billion to $4.5 billion, even though the DOT has capped the spending at $2 billion in their initial scoping report, and taken it off the table because of its impractical nature. And as Assemblyman Sturpey said, so the most vocal option out there right now is one that does not exist for a whole number of reasons. So when Yusuf was talking about how this conversation has gotten off track, yeah, I just double down on that and say we have to, everyone in this room has to do their part to make sure that the conversation is actually about the conversation. So the DEIS coming out, I would encourage us all to really take a hard look and be vocal, because as we said, there was a lot of pushback at the time. Yeah, so we intend to use that. I guess I'll cede my time there. Don't want to go on too long. I think it's important that we have a robust Q&A. But my goal on the Common Council and as a private citizen, and what I've been doing night and day, is to try to get the actual facts in front of people and get the information out there, because I feel a lot of people aren't in favor of the grid because they aren't aware of the actual information that's available out there. And the conversation we're having is not the conversation that is actually going on with the actual facts of what's going on. And to the points that Yusuf and others have relayed in Lanessa about, this isn't strictly about moving cars. This isn't strictly about moving military equipment across the country, which, you know, the initial intent of the federal highway projects. This is also about our community, our neighborhoods, the health of the people in our neighborhoods. And I just want to say thank you all for coming and caring about your community. And I hope that we can, as the DEIS comes out, we'll all be eagerly poised to react, to absorb the information. I hope you'll join. I know Barry will probably be one of the few people in the region who will read all 800 pages or whatever of the DEIS. So he'll need some friends in there with him to nerd out night and day to read some of these things with us. So I encourage you all to take this up, because I do think, you know, it's been said a lot of times that this is the most important decision that will face not our city, but our region for a very long time. And this is a lot of people have tried to harp on this as suburbs versus the city. I believe 100% this will be better for everybody. If you look at the net gains and losses, that this will be better for our suburban friends, better for our urban friends. And I hope you'll all look into all the facts as the DEIS comes out and be prepared to raise your voices, because I don't think we did it enough the first time around. And the main thing with this project is to get it right this time. Thanks, everyone.
So just quickly before we open for questions that we'll direct to whoever's best person to answer it. There's an article going around, the Community Grid Plus. I'm not sure how far it got. Has everybody got a copy of that yet? Okay, so did it get stuck somewhere, or do we run out of copies? I have 10 more copies here. I just wanted to mention that because before, when we were talking about the process of decision-making, informed decision-making versus consensus or compromise, and of course, the Save 81 folks have been promoting the tunnel with some street improvements above it as a compromise, faux hybrid, which it's not, compromise, which it's not. So if you want a vision of what a compromise would actually look like, a true compromise, look at the article that presents the Center State CEO position on Community Grid Plus. The plus is 10 areas of mitigation activity, which take into consideration the objections to a community grid that have been raised by folks in suburban communities largely, although there are some city issues. That is what a compromise might actually look like, if it's a true compromise, as a way of helping everybody think about and change the conversation about what a compromise would actually be if there is in fact such a thing. So let's just open up for questions, and we can direct them to whoever's the best person to answer it. Thoughts, ideas, suggestions? Dave?
There was a question here.
Well, okay. We have one mic. There is a mic in the room here.
Yeah.
Well, I guess we can pass it back.
We're loud.
Yeah, my name's Dave Ashley. I've been working with Bob on the AIA 81 task force, but there's some interesting things about the grid that maybe we could think more about. I mean, one of the things the grid can do is open up the south side to much better transportation, and also to improve it for if they were to connect, for example, into Calvin, which it does not, which the current plan does not connect, for the university and the hospitals would be a big improvement, for example. In other words, there would be some major improvements there. And Bob mentioned the 18 acres, and that would potentially, that's $1.5 billion of development. And up to, as if it were to be actually maximized, $40 million a year in real estate taxes for the city and $10 million for the county. And so there's major financial advantages for the city in doing that. And also looking at the tunnel, there's some fatal flaws that people don't realize about the tunnel. Well, I've looked at the tunnel study. It's a long thing and so forth. But one of the things, and very critical things in the tunnel study, if you go through at the end, there's a schedule. And on the schedule, it shows that the Route 81 elevated viaduct, which is falling apart now, you know, the pieces, pretty soon there are going to be pieces falling down on the street, would have to be maintained through the whole 10 years of construction of the tunnel. And also you couldn't start the so-called grid option until that 10 years is up. And this is because they can't, and until the tunnel's complete, you see, they can't tear the tunnel down. Now that's a nightmare for 81, DOT 81 to maintain that thing for another 10 years. It's falling apart right now. And so there's all kinds of things like that that are, and who's going to pay the $10 million minimum a year maintenance? The city doesn't have $10 million in its budget, and the 10 town councilors or 10 supervisors aren't stepping up and volunteering to pay that. So who's going to pay for maintaining that tunnel?
Bad time to raise my hand. David, you remind me of some other critical issues about the strategic building of each of the three. We should look at how they're being built and what happens first. One thing people don't know is the community grid is the only option, and correct me if I'm wrong, that first develops 481 and increases the capability of traffic at Route 5 as it goes through DeWitt and over at 481 and towards the thruway and at 69. So that would all happen first with the community grid, and it won't happen at all with the other two options. That's something that DeWitt may not know.
Yeah, and with respect to that, if you look at the time frame for construction for the community grid and the viaduct, they're the same. And so people have asked, well, why are they the same? The reason why they're the same is because the first 2 years of construction on a community grid will be improvement of 481, which would then be designated as 81 before anything begins downtown on the community grid and lowering the viaduct. That's to Bob's point. Yeah.
I know that the county legislature has asked to be part of the conversation. I was just wondering if anybody has, you know, if there's been any meetings to them and is there any sense of where they're leaning and what they're going to push for?
Anybody in the House that can speak to that? But Karen, you didn't really introduce yourself. You should reveal your warrior stat. Karen is one of the leaders of suburban folks for the community grid. She's a counselor for DeWitt. Our suburban champion, Karen.
While we're mentioning that, I'll just throw in for our next Green April. It's going to be the first Friday of the month, so April 5th, I believe. Sam Gordon and the planning staff at the town of DeWitt are going to be here to tell us about some of the great initiatives that are happening there. Anybody want to address the issue about the county legislature or any other questions?
Just as I understand it, the county legislature has passed a resolution in support of the tunnel option. And so I think it's important that there still be pressure that they reconsider that. And I think it's really important for folks who live outside of the city of Syracuse in the various towns and villages to make sure that their representatives on the legislature reflect a different type of posture, because the facts are they haven't been engaged by this side, if you will, as robustly as they've been pressured on the other side. And I think and I use those words engagement versus pressure because I think that really helps to paint the picture as to what's happening. When you have the same letter being produced to members of Congress, to members in the Senate, in the state Senate, in the state assembly, to the various town and village boards, they're producing the same letter. And that's not haphazard or coincidental. They didn't just say, you know what, like, we all are just thinking the same thing. We got the same vibe. There's someone producing these letters for them. And I think it's important that we push back and engage in a way that ensures that we're going in a different direction, because the facts are we are the voters. And sometimes I feel like this is also a lesson in democracy that we're engaging in. And really, you know, I'm too young to have like seen Schoolhouse Rock or, you know, like, but you know, there's a bill that's out on Capitol Hill. And so like people don't even know the levels of government and the responsibilities that each level have. And so this is an opportunity for us to really engage in a new conversation about how do we envision our collective responsibility amongst and with each other. And so I think that's an important piece to add to the dialogue.
I got to push back on that. You're old enough for Schoolhouse Rock.
I was born in '86.
Oh my God. Okay. Maybe you are.
Exactly.
All right. I'll let it slide.
I have a question.
Yep.
I'm also DeWitt Town Councilor with my bud over there, Karen Rigney, and I'm here for the engagement of the suburban leaders that you were just talking about, as is my colleague and friend.
Right.
And my question has to do with what Barry just said. I would like to know, and we were talking about it sotto voce, what the improvements to 481 about which you're speaking would be, other than, which would be considered an improvement one way and perhaps not another, adding the extra lane, plus the preservation of the wetlands that are in that section, the half to mile away section about which Mr. Driscoll was speaking, and how would those be taken into account in the analysis of the draft environmental impact study? Those are important for me to be able to say to our residents, as Karen and I are both working with our wonderful residents, and they ask me those questions. What can I say?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And I don't think we have a clear answer to that. One of the problems that we're going to encounter, again, which is why we need to prepare people for how to engage in the analysis of the draft environmental impact statement. Because DOT has, by and large, said in the past that they don't discuss mitigation until there's a record of decision. Now, we think that's fundamentally flawed process, and there's nothing in the regulatory apparatus that says that's the way it needs to be. That's just the playbook that New York State DOT is going by, but that playbook needs to be changed. So we agree with you. I think all of us up here agree with you that it's critical during the draft environmental impact statement public comment period that all of those issues that folks have that could be turned into a mitigation process come out in the conversation. During the public comment period, any group can ask DOT, GreeningUSA should ask DOT to come and make a presentation or be present with them in a conversation, a dialogue about the process, including things like mitigation. And the reason why that's important is because we don't want only forums that are controlled by DOT. If you only go to a hearing, you only go to a public meeting that DOT is holding, then the presentation will be controlled by them. We need to have meetings in which we bring DOT into those forums that are controlled by the communities that have questions, needs, answers that they want DOT to address, and force them to address them during the public comment period. You know, there's this notion that the process is set. I thought just for fun, I was going to hand some of these around, but we don't have tables like we did before. But if you want some clarity, I'll pass these around, you can look at it. This is the flow chart for the DOT process in the project development manual. Now, essentially what this flow chart says is anything's possible, and anywhere you are in the process, you can go back to the beginning and start over. I'll just throw some of those around and you can see just.
Can I just also comment? I appreciated your introductory comments that you had at Congressman Katko's town hall, where you talked about the destruction of the 15th Ward. And so I want to, respectfully say I appreciate those comments, and I think it was important that we continue to articulate that there has been harm done. I actually did have that question for DOT, and they actually provided two answers. The first answer, and I alluded to that in my introduction or in my whatever you want to call that. Oh, thank you. It's like the mic stand. But because that's the concerns that we were hearing. There were two major concerns coming out of the town DeWitt, Janesville area about the wetlands, environmental impacts in that respect, as well as the noise and the sound issues. Those were the two major points that we were hearing. And so I asked DOT directly, and they gave me a direct answer. They said actually for every acre of wetlands and every acre of natural space that will be disrupted, the DOT has to mitigate that by providing 4 times the amount of space. And so that's why I become even more convinced about and in fact, DOT said that we're not asked that question by the town supervisor. We're not asked that question. I'm just relaying what they were telling me at the time. And so I think it's the other piece is there was concerns about noise, and DOT said we actually can build these noise barriers, these sound barriers, to ensure that you reduce those issues. And so DOT can do that, and they can do it now. And I believe there's already funding in the process right now as a part of their $1.3 billion in with regards to the community grid that addresses, I believe, $100 million of that already is addressing many of those mitigation issues packed into the project already. And so you can and you should, I think, to Barry's point, articulate that to them and tell them that they need to have a meeting in the town to allay people's concerns and to articulate the points that they told me very straightforward and pointedly. I mean, I'm talking about the project director, the council, they were very clear to me that they can do this. They have to mitigate. They're required to mitigate. For every acre you lose, you will get 4 additional acres, which is why after I was like, wait a second, if the concern is we're going to lose land and the response is you'll get 4 times the land, then now the issue is moot, right? Like there's actually nothing to really be concerned with because you're gaining more than you are losing. And so I think folks need to hear that, and DOT needs to be transparent about that, and DOT should be engaged, and perhaps the town board can ask them to do this. And if you are having trouble, then we will help to facilitate for DOT to come out. And so I think it's important for folks to hear that.
In the same vein, way back in the beginning, I'm a member of Moving People Transportation Coalition, and in 2013, when this whole process started, we tried to engage Centro in conversation about what they were going to do during a construction, regardless of what the build alternative is, because traffic is going to be disrupted during that period. There is going to be money available to improve bus service during that period to address the need for additional bus service. Centro's position has always been, well, we won't talk about that until after the record of decision because, whatever we have to do, we'll have time to do it in the 1 or 2 year design process after the record of decision is made. It's similar to the issue with DOT. That we believe that's a huge mistake. That stuff needs to be part of the conversation during the public comment period to the draft environmental income statement, and it's incumbent upon us to make that conversation happen.
Thanks, Barry.
And I also think it's important to bust some myths that are out there. And so what I do hear from the town of DeWitt is the health implications of having trucks now on 481 versus having them on I-81. And the federal CDC, Center for Disease Control, is very clear on what the health risks are. And the health risks lie in if you have heavy concentrations of housing within a certain proximity to the highway. And so that's where your real health risks are. What they also are very clear to say is those health risks dissipate to almost zero when the highway is surrounded by trees. And then it dissipates even further to have no implications at all when you're 500 feet, 1,000 feet away from the highway. And so a lot of times when you get the pushback of what are the health implications of now trucks driving on 481, to the residents of DeWitt and Janesville, it's essentially none. It's zero. And you can find this study. We have it. We can produce it. We can send it to you. It's the federal study for the Center for Disease Control. And the title is Health Implications in the Proximity to Highways. And so a lot of it is about just busting these myths that are out there where people are kind of going in a frenzy because they don't really have a directive or anywhere to look for the information. unfortunately, it's our job to find it.
Yeah, so we're supposed to conclude at 1:30, so maybe we
And-
have at least one more question.
And if I could just say one thing, Karen, to your point as well, I think this region has suffered tremendously throughout the decades from siloed thinking, from us not coming together and just talking about stuff. And I really loved our mayor, Ben Walsh's first State of the City speech, where he said, we as the city advocates really want this grid, and we understand there are real concerns and there are real fears out there. But I hope that my goal as this starts to roll along after Congressman Cackle's town halls is to reach out to those suburban leaders and let's sit down, let's talk. I think if right now we're just hunkering down in our trenches and trying to, block each other's moves, when in reality, I think if we actually had the data and the facts, which is hopefully what will happen with the DEIS, we could have those honest conversations about thinking about this regionally and talking about everyone's concerns and trying to solve those.
Which is why I am here and wanted to be part of it.
I appreciate you. Thank you for coming, Karen. I appreciate you. I think we had Peter, and then if we have time for Joel.
Hi, I'm Joel McGill. I'm a Southsider. Hi, how's it going? First of all, I'm a community grid supporter, and when people ask me why are you supporting community grid, I take them to the very basic, and my answer is usually I'm a community grid supporter because I love life, and anything that make it less weird, I have a problem with that, right? So having a community grid, it may not solve all our problems, but it somehow pushes us toward reducing them, right? So that's Joe McGill, right? I guess my question to that, to Barry and all of you is, we had initially talked about interagency and interdisciplinary issues with DOT. My understanding is that DOT is not doing well with that, right?
Well, we won't know for sure,
Yeah.
but our experience
I'll say
has been, it's limited.
Okay.
Not the extent that we had.
I guess as people that are advocates and voices for others, is what are we doing to make sure that they come at least to somewhere acceptable, right?
Right.
That's the first question. The second question, and it's kind of common and somewhat question, is I'm very excited about this process, and the reason I'm excited is we are starting to engage in a place where we have never been engaged before, and that is as Southsiders, as people who live there. Now we are in a position where we say we got to get this thing out of here, and then you got people in DeWitt and Jamesville saying no, you can't bring this up here. So this is exciting because now we are starting to be on the same page as to what we're dealing with. Now we are trying to give them a little piece of that, and by redirecting the traffic, right? So we are trying to have them understand what we have been dealing for years. Okay, so if you're telling us you can't bring this, you can't reroute traffic because it's going to cause us a problem. Okay, well, it can't stay here. Let's figure out another way. This highway cannot be here because as a South Side, I grew up right there on Brighton. Duncan Bright area, right down Cannon Street. That's where I grew up. Okay, so as I stand outside my house, I can hear trucks going through. Can you imagine? I have people up there that live close to that area, next to the highway. They go through that. Again, it goes back to my point of life is sweet, and anything that makes it less sweet, sure have a problem with that, right? Right? So it is a common in a sense, but it's also in some way a question. But my main question goes back to the interagency, right? Interdisciplinary. What are we doing to make sure that the DOT is forthcoming with that, and that is more, right? There's more feasibility and
Right. So there has some of that has been going on, but for those of us who have been very involved in the process, and some of Bob and I and Dave, maybe a few others in the room, used to participate in something that was called a stakeholders working advisory group that met regularly with DOT. That process was stopped by DOT 2.5 years ago, and nothing was put in place to continue that kind of process. DOT has had conversations, dialogue with some groups, but we don't know what all that is until we see the draft environmental impact statement. That will be where we will be able to come up with some kind of definitive answer about the extent to which DOT has fulfilled their obligation to engage in interdisciplinary and interagency analysis of the critical environmental impact statement categories.
Just as I think there's a distinction between the interagency collaboration in the sense of the analysis of DEIS and what they should be doing prior to the DEIS being released. They are not engaging in interagency collaboration at the moment. That's not happening. And by that I mean, we know under every option that there is a potential for people to be displaced. There isn't the housing stock in the city of Syracuse for people to go because of the quality of the housing stock here. There isn't a source of income discrimination ban in the county, which means if you receive a voucher from the Department of Housing and Urban Development to be able to take your voucher to go to an apartment in the suburbs, that lawfully at the moment in the county, you can be discriminated against. And so there isn't a place for the 2,000 potential families who live in that area who will be exposed to these toxins to go in the city of Syracuse. And there isn't a guarantee that they can go anywhere in the county. And so when you have interagency collaboration, what that means is on the state level, Homes and Community Renewal needs to begin to procure funds to be able to mitigate those homes that have lead across the city. And the AG's office and the variety of government agencies at the state level have to address the issues, and the county has to address the issue about source of income discrimination to ensure that people have at least an option to do scatter plot housing across the county. So there isn't that type of collaboration happening, largely because DOT's position is they don't need to address it until after DEIS comes out. And I think we need to consistently push back on that notion, because we know that, again, and this is why I consistently bring up the case of the Sheridan Expressway example, because it's what the New York State Department of Transportation has done in New York State. And Lanessa has brought up the issue about the Tappan Zee Bridge and its replacement, and the distinction between the types of collaboration that happened in the South Bronx along the Sheridan Expressway and the lack of that type of collaboration in the replacement of Tappan Zee Bridge. And I lived in Rockland County on the other side of Tappan Zee Bridge, and it's a very affluent, wealthy community. On the other side, the Terrytown side, is also a very wealthy, affluent community. And they didn't get a good deal in that process by way of the mitigation becoming ad hoc. And so you can't leave your home between these hours. You can't open your window in the summertime between these hours. You can't use central air because it pulls in the air from outside and recirculates those toxins in your home. They offered to say to people, we're going to spray wash your windows once a week, as if that's a real solution. And people who had homes that were several hundreds of thousands of dollars to millions of dollars having to sell their homes for cheaper than their market value because of those things. And so when you don't have that robust engagement before the DEIS comes out, you're not able to have the type of mitigation that understands and plans for the types of potential impacts that can happen. You're kind of just, well, you know, this happened and let's fix this, and well, then that happened and let's fix that, and well, maybe we'll see what can happen here. And it's kind of like whack-a-mole, where you're just whacking every few seconds to see where the gopher will pop up. And so that's not a real solution. And so I just want to, while I agree with the need for interagency and interdisciplinary analysis, there isn't currently interagency collaboration before the DEIS comes out, which is a significant problem that we need to be imploring the DOT engage in and push back for them to say that they don't do that, because they have done it and they can do it, and there isn't a reason why they shouldn't do it. And if they do not do it, there will be problems that will arise that we haven't thought through in a robust or fair way. I want to also just end my point by saying our organization, NYCLU in Central New York, formed literally in response to people's homes being demolished. in the initial construction of 81. Our organization formed because at that time, there wasn't any engagement, right? Or the types of considerations weren't done in a way that protected people's civil rights to protest. I mean, can you imagine that we're telling you, you've got to go. We don't know where you got to go. We don't have any funds to get you there, but you got to go. We're going to demolish your community. And in many of those places, nothing has come into existence to this day, 50 years later. I want to remind us that it's very sore in the people's minds about what happened along this Midtown area. And I used to work here in Center of Excellence at the Center for Sustainable Community Solutions. So I'm a sustainability person at heart. Like, I love sustainability. I'm going to Mexico tomorrow to help a client deal with ending plastic use across their business. I'm a tree hugger. My concern with what happened, and I want to remind us about the problems without mitigating these issues before they become a problem, is that there's nothing where Kennedy Square used to be. Nothing where Kennedy Square used to be. People had 2 weeks before the holiday season to move. 2 weeks. And when you don't mitigate, when you don't think about and anticipate the types of challenges that are going to emerge, then you're going to have a repeat of the same types of realities that happened along this area. And this building is beautiful, but there ain't many folks who are in this building. And the Biotech Accelerator is gorgeous, but there ain't many businesses that are accelerating out of there. Or maybe they're accelerating so fast we just don't see them. I'm not confident, and I'm not sure. But what I do know is we have no clue where the people who had to leave to make place for those live. We don't know where they are. Are they homeless? Do they live in Syracuse? Are they in substandard housing? Do they have a safe, as Lanessa often says, landing? If you don't think about those things before you begin to decide on a project, you don't create the types of solutions that can mitigate that. And I think we're doing not only a disservice, we're doing a grave injustice to the people who have had to bear the burden of people's convenience.
So unfortunately, we have to conclude or they're going to turn the power off. So I want to thank everybody for coming.
Yeah, thank you very much, our panelists.
Sign the sign-in sheet and check for the EIS box if you want to participate. Mary, how are you? Great. Good to see you. I'll meet your colleague. Oh, yeah.